Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those of you who are joining us from across the world today on another edition of Pandemic Punditry, brought to you by the Content Experience Company. We are delighted and honored to have with us Elizabeth M. Adams, Chief AI Ethics Advisor at Paravision. She's also an AI Ethics Advisor to the United Nations and a Stanford University Fellow on Race and Technology. Welcome to Pandemic Punditry, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, we're glad that you're joining us today on a very sort of interesting subject. And we thought before we sort of ask you a bunch of questions, we'll help sort of maybe give a little context to our viewers so that they understand why it's so important to listen to what you have to say today. So the context that we would like to provide is that AI has become a driving force for unprecedented technological transformation. So, however, there's a diversity crisis in the field. We risk missing out on perspectives that could shape the most profound solutions to the challenges humanity is facing if we continue on our current path. So, according to Nature Index, in the United States in 2020, only 1.7% of technical roles at Facebook were held by African Americans. AI-powered applications and products can inherit or even amplify centuries-old biases, prejudices, and blind spots. For example, because of biased training data, algorithms intended to diagnose skin cancer fail to identify potential cases in patients with darker skin. Similarly, an AI system for predicting a decline in kidney function was found to be much more accurate for male patients than for female patients. So that, I hope, gives our viewers a little bit of context to why we are so keen to sort of talk to you about AI and what AI needs to really take in, the inclusivity required, the diversity required in AI. And Elizabeth is an expert in the area, so we figured we will tap into some of your expertise today in our conversation, Elizabeth.
Absolutely.
So maybe I can start with the questions and ask you. I think some people, I know the lay folks who are not into technology, sometimes don't understand how pervasive AI has become. They think it's sometime in the future. They think of Terminator and other things and say, oh, that's going to happen in, we're 10 years away. But maybe you can help us sort of set some parameters or boundaries around how pervasive AI actually is today. I mean, not the future, but right now. If you could, share some information.
Sure. Well, yeah. So to your point, AI is a part of every facet of our lives. And just a real simple example are some of the streaming services that people may use, whether it's Netflix or whether it's Hulu. And so what AI does is it really just takes a computer and helps it think at a much faster pace than humans, right? And so what it does, if from a Netflix example, is it might serve up movies that it thinks that you are interested in based on previous movies that you've watched. And so from that perspective, it's assuming, right, through the AI model that these are stories that you're interested in, but they may miss, which Netflix does, a whole host of programming that also may be of interest to you. And it can also transfer over, and you've mentioned a number of industries, but it can transfer over to the banking industry when banks decide what loans different groups should get, or what insurance companies decide what rates certain communities should get for their automobiles or for their homes. And so even with the example of the hospital, there are some cases where AI is helping determine whether a patient is ready to be discharged. And so it's all over, it's in every piece of our life. And so I think we have to remember that we can no longer kind of separate technology from society. It is very much blended. We are in the fourth industrial revolution where there's the blurring of the lines of biological and digital and physical. And so it's here today, to your point.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's a very important point to make, because I think people think of this as a future thing and wonder, why should we care right about now? I mean, when we get there, we can solve the problem. And I think it's a very important point you made, that it's quite pervasive. It's in places that we probably wouldn't know it already exists. So with that in mind, we found this sort of quote by Google's CEO Sundar Pichai when he said that AI is one of the most important things that humanity is working on. It is more profound than, I don't know, he said, electricity or fire, right? And Elizabeth, I'm wondering, are we playing with fire when we talk of AI devoid of ethics?
Devoid of ethics, yes. But here's what I want to say, and this is where I'm kind of transitioning in my own work. So for the past 3 years, I've really been focused on algorithmic bias and AI ethics. But guess what? Technology is not going away. So we need to kind of lean in and embrace the possibilities and also help win the race on purposeful AI. And I think it's upon us, those of us who are interested in the future of AI, to start clearing or creating a path for those who are interested in AI to follow. What is purposeful AI? AI that makes a society work so that the society can prosper and thrive, so that we can eliminate more of the bad actors in the area. And so we focus so much on these bad actors and these bad organizations, and we need to, but there just, in my opinion, hasn't been enough focus on what the real possibilities are, because we will be, in several years, working beside robots and drones and other forms of artificial intelligence. And so I think we have a real opportunity from a global cooperation perspective to kind of lean in and work together to provide a future where we can all work together and live together with AI.
Oh, that's an interesting take. Karthika, I know you're itching to get in.
Thanks, Ravi. Liz, we were following a lot of the work that you're doing, and of course, some of the advances that have happened in AI and some of the repercussions of it. So, for the sake of our audience, could you describe to us some of the pitfalls or potential scenarios of what has happened or what could happen if AI operates without an ethical or moral kind of safeguard or boundary?
Yeah, I can actually talk about the project that I'm working on through my Stanford Fellowship, which is, it originally started last year around this time to bring transparency to the city of Minneapolis around the technology it used to help govern society. And at the time, my interest was facial recognition technology, body cams, and video surveillance. And so it's been a whole year of research and working with a coalition team to kind of educate policymakers and commissions and boards on the harmful impacts of certain technologies on vulnerable populations and communities of color. And let's take facial recognition. We know that some facial recognition technologies do not have great ethics. They're not fair and equitable. They're not transparent. They're not explainable. And the leadership is not accountable. And in the city of Minneapolis, we happen to be using Clearview AI. If you were to do a simple search on Clearview AI, you'll see that the Canadian government has actually banned it. And now I believe Europe is looking to ban its use as well. But here in the US, many law enforcements use it because they can quickly, get a large scan of faces and use that, in my opinion, to overreach in society, to track people for bringing in their own human bias and augmenting that bias with bias technology, and then further creating oppressive situations. So in our case in Minneapolis, we are actually providing testimony later today on the harmful impacts of this bad technology. The error rates are just high. YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook have offered cease and desist letters to Clearview AI. And so that's just one situation. That's just one of many situations where this could be potentially harmful for, as I mentioned, vulnerable populations and people of color. So this is an education process for policymakers. It has been a long year, but it has been a worthwhile year. And my hope is that if we can use this facial recognition model to help educate policymakers, then when we start to think about additional surveillance type technologies, we have something in place.
Okay. Wow. All right. Thanks, Elizabeth. So this is kind of related to the work that you do with PostMe, or?
Yes, that is it. So PostMe, Public Oversight of Surveillance Technology and Military Equipment. So that was the work that the coalition is a part of. What we did last year is we had that proposed ordinances unanimously approved to go to committee in the city of Minneapolis. And that means it goes inside the city of Minneapolis, the city attorney, city clerk, They start evaluating the proposal. Based on a number of events that happened in the city, we decided to pull out facial recognition bans specifically because there was so much work in the other pieces of the ordinance, and it was going to take a little bit more time. So that's where we are, and that is part of the civic tech process. You never know what's going to happen until you start working on, being an advocate for your community. You just don't know what's going to happen. So here we are today. The vote is actually on Friday, but testimony is today. So it's a great time to actually, be sharing this. It was a lot of work, and very thankful to be working alongside some great, brilliant partners.
And just so that our worldwide audience is aware, Minneapolis was in the news last year because of that terrific, horrible incident with murder of George Floyd. So it's very sort of, I guess, timely and compelling that what you're doing is happening in this city, which sparked off a huge outcry, rightly so, globally.
Yeah, but I will also add that the city of Minneapolis took steps before George Floyd's murder, which was they established a racial equity division in December of 2017. They also declared racism a public health emergency in July of 2020. And they also passed data privacy principles in February of 2020. So there was some work that had already been done in the city. But with technology advancing so fast, it's hard to get a grasp on its harmful benefits, or not benefits, its harmful ways in the community. And so this was part of the education process, was helping policymakers understand we can no longer separate technology and its impacts on communities and their ability to thrive or not thrive.
Karthika?
Yeah, so Liz, so do you believe that companies that develop and deploy AI should kind of self-regulate themselves by developing their own ethical and moral frameworks? What is the solution here?
If there weren't a bottom line, if people weren't trying to make money, then possibly, right? If everyone was building AI for good, then you could possibly self-regulate, which is the reason why I am for proposing purposeful AI that is community-driven and community where there's community participation, right? So we're all a part of this. But yeah, I don't, and unfortunately, that's why people are rushing to work with policymakers. And in fact, initially, I started following my curiosity in this space, working with data scientists and engineers, and I realized, okay, that's not going to get to the goal of safe technology, safe and transparent technology. Then I started working with leaders in organizations and realized that helping them develop AI ethics principles was a good step, but it was only really just helping them be explainable in case there was a hiccup, right? So then I wanted to work more with policymakers to say, look, before this technology makes its way into our communities, we need to have discussions about testing, training, how is it developed, how was it sold, how is it procured, all of those things that what I include in the ethical, kind of tech design life cycle, which is from inception to marketing and customer care and the user experience. All of that needs to be considered when a city decides to use that technology. And so that was why I wanted to get involved in the city work, because I wanted to understand that full life cycle process.
So sort of piggybacking on that, and also want to sort of get your perspective, obviously, on what you've sort of evolved into this purposeful AI framework. So is that a framework that can be adopted by tech companies or people who actually procure AI technology for, simple business uses, right? So we have this pervasive technology used by commercial interests, public organizations, right? Federal actors, state actors, right? A whole gamut, right? I mean, all of human society at multiple levels is now adopting various AI technologies and related tech. So how does, what is purposeful AI? And is that a sort of a universal framework or sort of a code of things? How can if you can explain that, that'd be great.
Purposeful AI is an opportunity. So the reason why I started thinking about this was because a couple of weeks ago, I had a conversation with someone about what life would be like in 2050. And they asked me what I thought about AI ethics in 2050. And I'm like, hopefully AI ethics will be so 2021, right? By the time we get to 2050, it's just going to be blended. And it gave us a chance to really imagine what life would be like. So if I have a robot in my home who's doing certain things and I go out and there's a robot cleaning the street, or I don't know, gardening, let's just use that as an example because we're thinking about 2050, and that happens to be the robot of my neighbor, maybe that robot can tell me that I can meet my neighbor at the coffee shop, right? So how are we really blending all of these AI-enabled technologies to work so that society can prosper and thrive? Now, I did not coin the phrase. I saw this phrase when I did some initial research that it popped up like in the last few years. 2016, I think, is the earliest that I saw. And it was really this concept of blending all of the different AI-enabled technologies, whether it's drones, whether it is gait recognition, whatever it is that is now being used for surveillance. But how can we purpose it in a way so that it's not harmful and actually aids in helping? So it's not necessarily, it's an opportunity, I'll say. And it's an opportunity to that I'm starting to have with a lot of leaders around the globe when they're making a decision about which way to go in AI. And I'm like, well, let's think about this versus, how can we create a world that limits the bad actors and encourages more good actors, if that makes sense.
Okay. So
Sorry,
go ahead.
A question, Mari, if you don't mind. It's a lighthearted one, but in all seriousness, if we fail to limit this, right, and fail to create a framework for purposeful AI, is Skynet going to be real?
I'm sorry, say that again. I missed the last part.
Is Skynet, like in Terminator, is that going to be real?
Hey, who knows? Who knows? I mean, I worked for the government for a number of years, and stuff that I'm seeing now is stuff that I saw like 15 years ago. So who knows, right? I think it's up to us. And this is why I love these types of conversations, because everyone has a place in AI. I don't care what your background is, if it's in banking, if it's health, if you sell shoes. Like, you have an expertise on how certain things should work for feet. Like, everyone has an opportunity to help shape our future. And I hope that, through this conversation and others, that we encourage people to follow their curiosity into the space and see where they might land so that it can be purposeful, so that we can have fair and equitable outcomes.
So in this kind of, push to have fair and equitable outcomes where AI is concerned, you are not advocating, and I sense that you're not, from this purposeful AI, that given the sort of the multitude of sort of problems AI is solving, right? I mean, it runs sort of the whole gamut of human experience, it almost, right, across the globe. You're not actually thinking that it's realistic or practical to have a single global, universal, or even a national set of guidelines, right? You're maybe developing some sort of, for each of these scenarios that you're talking about, you're thinking about a purposeful AI that deals with specific scenarios. I mean, with some basic principles in mind. I mean, like issues of transparency, things like that being sort of fundamental guiding principles, as opposed to like a universal, not to use a universal UN term, not a universal declaration of AI ethics or something like that, right? That's not what we're going for.
Well, let me just clarify. I'm one person with one idea that is putting my idea out in the world, like many, many others. I'm still shaping what that looks like. I have a friend, a colleague who works at Rolls-Royce and is the head of AI at Rolls-Royce, and they specifically focus on models that help improve jet engines. They need to be discriminatory in how they create their models because they don't want all the information from a plane. They only want this real-time information that helps them keep planes in the air, right? So they've got to work on something separate, but they're also working on behalf of keeping the public safe, right? So there are lots of different ways that we can think about purposeful, fair, and equitable. I'm just one person, and it's based on my lived experience of having been excluded, having experienced racism, having experienced discrimination and prejudice, so that I'm leaning into a world where I don't have to experience that and I can still enjoy the benefits of technology. And I don't know what that's going to look like from a regulation perspective or a guidelines perspective. I don't know what new group might pop up and say, hey, we're the authority on purposeful AI, and here's a framework and here's a certification that you go through. I don't know. And but I just know that for me, when I step into the AI space every day, I just want the world to cooperate in a way where we can all feel good and feel safe in the communities that we live in, and we can reach across the globe and offer goodness to each other.
Well put. Okay, Kartika, sorry.
Thanks. Thanks, Lavi. So I think a friend of yours, the CEO of the AI for the People, Mutali Konde.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So she had said, to paraphrase what she said, do we need to fundamentally change or alter the nature of AI from being an instrument of efficiency to being an instrument of equity? And sort of, to that end, how can companies kind of imbue AI with an inherent desire to be equitable and fair?
So what I would do is I would push that back to Mutali, because she's the expert in the space that she leads. But what I would say for me is when I talk about equity equity also starts in the design process. There are many, many ways that equity can play out. It can also play out with who's at the table, but not just who's at the table, but the ownership of the table. And I'll give you an example, and this is not necessarily the AI design process, but if you are calling me for my expertise and I'm going to help you develop ethics principles and I'm going to help you shape your governance project and process, why would I not be part owner in that process? That's where equity is, because otherwise what you're doing is you're taking my 30 plus years of lived experience, all my degrees, all my certifications, everything that I've learned how to do in 10 minutes, took me 30 years to learn how to do in 10 minutes, and you're paying me an hourly rate, but yet when we're done, you're going to go off and make millions. So equity is places within the framework of the technology space. So yes, equity in terms of what are the questions that we are asking before we even train our model, equity in your marketing materials. If you are marketing to communities of color or vulnerable populations, do you have the right materials? Do they say the right things? Who was at the table having that conversation? On and on about equity. And then we could talk about pay equity. We could talk about gender equity. So to that question, I would toss that back to Mutali, who's my good friend and my colleague. But I can talk about equity from my perspective.
So you brought up an interesting point about at beginning in the design part of this. We have a lot of audience members I know from past experience who are technical in nature, who are building products that incorporate AI and machine learning and things like that into the products that they're designing and building today. And there are people from all over the world, from all walks of life. And I also like, that's one data point. The other data point that you made that was really interesting was that, we all have a chance to participate and should participate, irrespective of our background, whether we are technical or non-technical, whether we are into shoes or into something else, right? That plurality of conversations and voices in crafting the future of technology, which is very AI heavy, is in all our best interest, right? This is not to be, we're not going to abstract this or let this be a conversation where only technical people reign, right? This is everybody's conversation, because this is a significant portion of the human experience going forward.
Absolutely.
So with those two things in mind, if you were to advise, a young technical person, male or female, of color or not, what are some of the things that they need to know? They're using this technology. They're new to this technology. They're obviously very excited about new technology. They want to deploy it. They want to get expertise. What are some things that they should keep in mind from your experience to make sure that we, from day one at point of design, keeping the right sort of things in mind when we are using AI? What are some of the things? I mean, maybe one or two things.
From using AI, or
when they're
wanting
developing
to
or
get
designing a
into?
new AI app or using technology like AI in their products.
So you're talking about a data scientist, or you're talking about a leader
Data
of data
scientist,
science?
an application developer, software architect.
So one of the things I would suggest is become a part of an AI ethics community. So there is Lighthouse 3. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. It has a whole AI ethics website that has also women who work in AI ethics, and they have a newsletter that comes out that shows you all the things that are happening in the AI space. I'd also suggest joining some group like AI Women in AI that has various, avenues and paths for you to travel, because I think it's very hard if you are a data scientist and your organization does not have data ethics or AI ethics principles, and they're not kind of pushing down diversity and inclusion in the conversation within the work teams. And that was something I actually wrote an article about that on LinkedIn about D&I in work teams. So I would suggest becoming a part of a network where you can start to inform yourself on these important things and understand that it is a practice. You're not going to ever read an article and become an expert. It's not just one project that you will have under your belt where you will become an expert. I've been a technologist for over 20 years, but I've only been in the AI space for 3 years. But I leaned all the way in, and I followed my curiosity, and I still haven't stopped. And so, and also find out what is of interest to you. And you do that by following your curiosity. Not everyone wants to work in AI ethics. Some people want to work on the future of AI. And so you partner with the AI ethicist, right? And then you can develop a better future. So I would just caution people not to feel like they have to travel down an AI space just because it's popular. Find something that you're interested in and move in that direction.
Excellent advice.
But Lavi, I think you did touch on a really good point, though, about data scientists, application developers, even being aware of the fact that when they build software, AI-related software, that there is this ethics element. I'm not so sure in the emerging nations that this kind of thinking is so pervasive. I think as far as they're concerned, it's still a very okay, I'm a software, engineer. I got to build this piece of code. I'm just going to go build this piece of code. The ethics of it, I don't think comes into play. So, I mean, obviously one part is the activism and people like yourself, Liz, talking about it. But isn't it also up to the organizations, the CEOs, the people in charge to say, okay, this AI thing I'm going to build is self-learning, it's going to grow. Got to consider ethics of this whole thing.
Well, we all should we all should be responsible for our part in how AI is developed, and how how the models are trained, and how it makes its way into society. And in my initial conversations with data scientists and engineers and architects, there wasn't that understanding of the second and third order consequences once that technology they helped build makes its way into a client's, environment, and then, it's impacting. But they're not trained to think that way. And that was one of the reasons why I said individually, it would be good for a person to connect with a network, a group, an AI ethics group, to find out and learn some of the challenges. But also, some CEOs will lean in and some won't. So, for me, until they do, and until there's regulation, I would suggest that an individual take it upon themselves. In my discussions with them, as I mentioned, some of them thought that they were already ethically kind of designing things. And so that was a very interesting place for me to kind of split. So I said, okay, that's what I mentioned earlier. I realized that this isn't really the right place for me to kind of talk about algorithmic bias. And that's when I started working with leaders. And then I started working with city government. So, there's many different places. You would hope that an organization would take that on, but clearly they haven't, and we've seen that demonstrated out in the global marketplace.
Just listening to you, Liz, Elizabeth, I'm thinking there's sort of two points that you're making that maybe audience might want to take into consideration. One is, if you're a business owner or a CEO or a buyer of this technology, or somebody who says, hey, look, let's get the latest, greatest AI stuff. Why don't you use AI? Advises their technical staff to do that, either to build it themselves or to procure it. In either case, that person who is as an executive, I think they need to ask some questions as a lay person that's not technical around diversity and equity, right? I mean, hey, look, what is the data? Where is this coming from? Is this data sourced this way? Are we accounting for the bias that could be in that data, right? And the fact that it could be exclusionary to begin with. It could be, data that, is from a source that clearly is exclusionary, right? So I think there are some questions and investigations and hard questions that the CEOs or the executives need to ask. But there's also a set of questions that are different that you're advocating that the developers themselves need to ask, is to actually re-examine their own personal biases, right? Because we know in the tech industry, it's predominantly male, and in some companies it's predominantly white male, right? And so you have all of these things, so that they themselves don't think of the bias, that the things that they've built in the past before AI came around, the old data sets that are running around that they're now using, could have all of that, prejudice, bias, and exclusion in that data, and all you're doing is amplifying it with AI. And so, if you don't have that self-awareness that there is an issue, then you're just perpetuating this inherent bias. And now, more than any time in the future, if Black Lives Matter made any impact on you, and if the pandemic made any impact on you, I think it's time to say we should really question those sort of fundamental givens as not so fundamental, but a historic sort of legacy that needs to be re-examined from a different lens. And I think
I should be interviewing you. That was perfect.
I'm just paraphrasing the nugget of gold that you're giving me. So I think that's clearly what you're saying, right? This is not something you're absconding to governments to come up with. This is something that all of us,
So what's interesting about everything you just said is that sometimes I think people think that myself as a practitioner, that I have all the answers, and I don't. And that is why I love to join various communities, IEEE, other frameworks that are being developed. I'm always out there, listening and paying attention, so that I can kind of point someone in a certain direction once we kind of have that conversation. But that's what I do. It would be nice if others who are really serious about this did the same thing, right? Because I'm one person, I can't be split into, a million pieces. And so, and I've done as much as I can with writing articles about how to create diversity and inclusion within artificial intelligence work teams. And yes, there's responsibility that needs to happen there. There's responsibility that needs to happen at the director level and the executive level and the board level. But if you're not used to having a diverse staff, how do you even know to ask that question of yourself? How would you even know? Right? And so that is why I try to implore government officials to look and say, look, technology and society, we cannot separate them. You cannot just talk about housing and jobs and health without talking about technology. You can't talk about streetlights without technology, road closures without technology. And the same with executives, right? You can't talk about, whatever product that you want to get out there without talking about technology. But it does call for some very, very hard, tough conversations that not everyone is ready to have. But what I also want to say is it doesn't matter what seat you sit in from an AI perspective, however you're looking out into the world from your seat, all of us can play a part. So if you're a policymaker, you have a part. And as you mentioned, if you're an executive, you have a part. And my thing again is it's practice and start somewhere and start today.
Well said. Karthika?
Yeah, thanks, Lavi. So just switching gears just a little bit, we recently had the Chief Movement Officer of Amnesty International on our show to talk about a bunch of stuff that happened in the US. But what was interesting is Amnesty recently called for a ban on facial recognition in New York City. And for the sake of our audience, can you explain to us why this ban is important and what are the repercussions if we don't succeed in banning this piece?
Yeah. So I don't know offhand what application is used in New York, but you mentioned Mutali. So Mutali's organization has partnered with Amnesty, and they have also joined on as a coalition to host me, and so they will be testifying today. So facial recognition technologies, some of them that have been sold to law enforcement, have a higher error rate when identifying people of color, and specifically women of color. And the way that they annotate certain data, such as face prints and also some other things when they show a facial image, just are not accurate. And one of the examples that we use is an example of a Black man who has a thermometer because of COVID, and he is checking the temperature of someone. And we ran it through a facial recognition system that is just available on the internet. And it shows that this is a man with a gun. And when we lightened the image, it shows a man, right? And so that is why can potentially be harmful, because it's just not accurate enough. They just have not done a good enough job of including more data sets, more training data in their data sets to be accurate. So you take that system that inherently has, high error rates for a certain population that is already over-policed. It's already over-policed. There are already more Black people going to jail for the same crimes as white people. And so now their images are in this database. Now their images are being fed over and over into a facial recognition system. Then you have, which happens in Minneapolis, our law enforcement officers in Minneapolis do not need to live in the city of Minneapolis. Only 8% do. So you're bringing in your human bias. Your kids don't play with the kids in the community. You don't know the store owners. You're not a part of the community. So you're bringing your human bias in. It's augmented with this technology that has high error rates. Well, guess who suffers? Vulnerable populations and people of color who do not have a seat at the table in the design process, a seat at the table in the decision-making process about where this technology should be used. And there's no equity in terms of ownership in the company or in the decision-making process around policy. So that's why a number of people stand up as advocates to say, we need to do better. We need to do better. And we need to ask questions such as, why would you allow this harmful technology to help govern society? If you know better, why haven't you done better as leaders? So that's the experience that we're having in Minneapolis. And we followed, our post-me is actually following the post-New York. That was our hope, so theirs was public oversight of surveillance technology in New York. We added post-me public oversight of surveillance technology and military equipment in Minnesota. And now we've pulled out the facial recognition ban. So I hope that it kind of explained it.
It does. Better. It does in great level of detail.
I'm still reading from the thermometer gun thing. Oh my God.
Which begs me to ask the question, sitting in Sri Lanka and India, with all of this AI technology stuff concentrated in the more, shall we say, developed countries, and with developed countries themselves, the marginalized population facing this issue, what is the repercussion for emerging countries? What is the repercussion for Africa?
Well, I mean, I know that technology is pervasive here too. You'd be surprised at the number of technologies that are deployed in this part of the world as well, because it's very easy today. I mean, you can apply the same facial recognition technology here in India, for example, and I know it's here. I don't know whether it's the same company, but there's a lot of it here as well.
Well, and as I said, that is why I want to move to purposeful AI, because if you start shifting the conversation to what is good AI and how can we make it work, then in my opinion, we move towards that versus always trying to find a solution or ban bad AI, if that makes sense. And that is one of the reasons why I'm excited to be, a member of a key constituent for the 3C Roundtable on artificial intelligence at the United Nations, because I get a chance to speak to people all over the world about their challenges with AI and be a part of a global cooperation solution. So we need to talk across the globe and not just bring our own perspectives. For me, the Western perspective, I'm very interested to find out what's happening in other parts of the world. But yeah, I'm just one person. I'm a practitioner trying to do my part. I'm not by far the expert of all things AI, but we can all, play a part. And I'm excited about that.
Great.
So, sorry, Lavi, do you
No, I know you have a question.
My question was, why aren't more heads of state talking about AI?
I don't know. I don't know. I think that's something.
You would assume that would be number one on their agenda because it's going to shape the future generation and humanity to come.
Well, guess what? Those of us that are talking about it, we need to help bubble it up in our own communities. That's really what we need to do. We need to give ourselves permission to have these conversations and do something as simple as, use the 240 characters in a tweet, use a LinkedIn post, write an article. We all have to, do this work together if we want, to live in safe communities where technology is there, but it's also, allowing us to thrive and prosper. So all of us, I would never just point to one person and say it is your responsibility to drive AI for a whole nation, right? I mean, if I'm living in that nation, then I need to help as well, if I'm interested in it.
So I'm just wondering whether there's sort of a different sort of silver lining from these case studies you threw up about, the thermometer and others, right? So as things get more commercial, right, and commercial entities deploy AI to sell more things or whatever, they can't afford, from a business perspective, hopefully, to have bias, right, or have incorrect results, right? So if the AI says, hey, no, you need to do X instead of Y, and that was based on a poorly conceived sort of bias, and you sell less of X, or because you completely ignore a market simply because your bias about that market was informed by the color of the people, the skin color of the people living in that geography, then you miss a whole slew of things that you could have sold and prospered economically. Whether that incentive of sort of getting the data right and getting the AI correct based on a purely profit motive as opposed to anything else, whether that he will eventually help sort of clean up some of this mess on the commercial side of things. I'm not talking about the governments, and I'm not talking about the public sector so much, but more in terms of the commercial entities, right? Because at some point, somebody's going to say, wow, we missed that. I mean, why did we miss that? That, and that did not that impacted our bottom line or our top line. Let's fix it, right? I mean, so I don't know how much of, that influence will have in sort of cleaning up some of this stuff. But then again, I think those questions also need to be asked, as you're sort of admitting, right? So this kind of activism is required.
Yeah. Well, and we're just transferring habits over to AI. So before AI, companies were rushing to be the first to market to sell their widget or to sell their product. And anyone who was impacted was obviously an afterthought in their design process. And they worked to clean it up once someone in society let them know that, hey, I'm impacted by it. It's the same with AI. It's a rush to market. It's a rush to be the first to, offer some sort of AI technology. And then when those who are harmed by it speak up, then all of a sudden it becomes a priority. And a lot of companies do not even have the budget for the rework. I talked to one company. I went in to use their avatar in a virtual reality space. And quite frankly, I looked like a monster. They had not done a good enough job using darker skin, natural hair in their design process to create an avatar. The arm color was different than the face color. And so I had a conversation with them and their developer and was told they just hadn't had enough money and enough time to put that in before their launch, but they had thought about it. So that's the kind of stuff that happens. And when you're on the receiving end of it, it's not fun. No. Right? I want to be able to go into a virtual reality experience and work with my colleagues and see how that technology works so that we can build and collaborate and strategize on something cool and fun. But if I don't look like myself in the virtual reality space and they use the AI for that, how am I supposed to feel? And so it always happens that we're an afterthought in many cases, and we talked about from health and banking, we're always an afterthought on the from the life savings innovations that can happen. And it's always someone from the marginalized community or communities of color that have to step up and say, hey, look, we've got to do something different. I do not want to be an afterthought. I want to be a part of the planning and the designing and developing, as I mentioned, something more purposeful. Because if you are not that person that's ever been excluded or discriminated against, you don't think it's that bad. You think, oh, we'll fix it in the new release, the next release. I'm not a release. I'm a human. I'm a human being. I have feelings. I want to go to the lake. I want to go watch my nieces and nephews play soccer. But guess what I'm doing? I am helping companies move towards more fair and equitable outcomes in technology, because they're not thinking about every person. And so to your point, I don't know if that will change, because there's always this rush to be first to market. And there will always be, now we're just kind of transferring that over to AI. There will always be cases. And there will always be jobs, right, for people to step up from an AI ethics perspective.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, by the way. While I did bring up the point, I think what we are seeing is sort of, whatever the sins of the past were, we'll continue to perpetuate them if we don't take really stringent, direct action to change it, right? Because it's easy to sort of watch over, as you just mentioned, with this classic example of, oh yeah, we'll come up with the next version, and we thought about it, but it was expensive, and you don't really matter, right? I think that's the risk of that is much higher.
Yeah, and to your point, Lavi, but the disadvantage there is when AI is biased, it becomes exponential, right? Because it can grow at such a rate, and before you know it, it has it has just inculcated itself into the fabric of our culture. So it's extremely dangerous, and hats off to you, Liz, for kind of stepping up and saying, okay, I'm going to be that person who's going to be the voice of reason.
Well, I'm trying. I'm like I said, I'm one person, but I want to move into something, different kind of solutioning where everyone is considered, but we have to get out and educate people and let people know that it doesn't matter what your role is in society or in life or how much you make, if you're an hourly worker or salaried worker, your perspective is valuable, and helping people, understand and to give themselves permission to go for these opportunities.
I have been told, I have read that some AIs, with machine learning and deep learning, things like that, they sort of get an intelligence of their own, and that the creators of that technology don't actually know what goes on, right? So that the AI sort of takes over, it's learning things, and I think there've been some incidences even at Google where they've actually shut the machine down simply because they have no idea, that this intelligence had sort of grown to a point where they didn't know how it was actually making some of these decisions. What are the chances, and I think they're quite high, that an AI like that learns all of the bad things that we have inherently structurally in our society in terms of biases, instead of exclusivity and all of this stuff, and it amplifies that, and it learns stuff that we also don't know what the hell it's learned now, and then it's unleashed, right? I mean, unlearning that and switching that off, I don't think we've even thought through the repercussions of what that actually may look like or be like. And I think that's why I think
scary.
Like you are, I think are scared, and are rightly so.
You're assuming you can switch it off. What if it gets to a point where you can't switch it off?
Exactly.
Right. But what if, and this is where I like to go, what if we build something that it can switch it off, because we fed a system so much goodness, we fed it so many positive images of people loving other people, being nice and being kind, and using products responsibly, ones that keep our earth intact. What if that was also there and they met somewhere in the middle? Now we're going far out, right? We're reimagining something many years ahead, but there has to be an alternative because we spend so much time worrying about doomsday, right? I know that's how I got into this space, because I'm like, oh my gosh, I got into this space because I thought, if AI is shutting me out from a facial recognition perspective, how am I going to get into certain buildings? How am I going to get into my car? How am I going to? But that was where I started. But now I'm like, okay, we've got to feed our world and people interested in it another way, so that when these things start to happen, there's something that we already have that can kind of intercept.
So what you're saying is, take the best of us, and even ones that we haven't achieved it as a society maybe, but we want to inculcate the best of human nature, the best of our behaviors into the AI. So put a better version of ourselves into the artificial intelligence. And then hopefully that makes us all better, because our artificial intelligence helps us get there, right? Where we may have failed as a species, the AI succeeds and brings us.
And we may not be here for that. We may not be here for that. That might be 60 years from now. Sure. Maybe not. I don't know. Right? But we need to start. We need to do that now, because otherwise all we are going to do is be focusing on bad AI. And I want us to live. I'm sorry?
This better humanity through AI is a distinct possibility if what you suggest happens, right? That we take.
If we do it, if we start the practicing. I don't know, maybe there's some labs out there now that are doing it. I hope to find out. I hope to learn. One of the fun things I got to do, as I mentioned, was have this conversation about what life would be like in 2050. That energized me beyond what anything I could imagine. I had no idea that that would kind of light a new fire under me. And I think when I talk to other people about people who want to be inspired and people who want to be motivated, these are different ways that we can do that for the generation that is coming, or for even those who want to move into the AI space now. Give them an alternative, give them a path.
Wonderful. Karthika, in the few minutes we have left, you want to ask one last question?
I have one more question for Liz.
Okay.
So, you were recently on a panel with Dr. Timit Gebru, if I'm not mistaken, right?
I was not. You
were not? Oh,
nope.
Did you host something with her? I thought you were hosting.
No, my Stanford colleague, Hung Kuo, did.
I see.
He was the moderator for the panel.
I see. Okay, my bad.
Yeah.
So she recently said that she wants people to associate activism not just with marching in the streets, but also with data activism. Now, I know you've said throughout our session that everyone has a role in AI to play, but what does data activism mean, and how can non-AI experts get involved?
I do not know what Dr. Gebru meant by that, so I would throw that back to her again. And I will be honest, I typically don't like to comment on someone else's quotes, because I don't want to get it wrong and I don't want to project or interpret it incorrectly. But I do know that digital inclusion, digital advocacy, digital justice, all of those things are important, and we definitely need to think about them. But I also think that there are different ways to protest. So I have been working with an immersive company called GRX Immersive, and they developed a movie called Points of View. And it's actually a drone that follows this guy who was he got out of prison early. And as part of that process, a drone follows him, learns him, and all of that. And now I lost my train of thought. Shoot, I was going somewhere really, really good with that. Oh, about equity and, was it digital equity? Shoot, I apologize.
I'm sure they'll come back. So
yes.
So I think what we should do, and we hope we can pull this off, is to have Dr. Gebru with you and maybe some others to really explore this and unpack this further on a future AI panel. If you are up to it, we would love to have you back. and get a little bit more meat on the bone, if I was to use that analogy, being a vegan. But but yeah, I think this has been a absolutely sort of fascinating conversation, Elizabeth, from our perspective, and I hope our listeners and viewers think the same.
Well, can I ask you, what is your takeaway here? So if I could ask you both, what was your main takeaway?
Karthika, you go first, and then I can.
No, my takeaway was, Liz. So in Sri Lanka, we're going to be one of the IT tech bodies is going to be hosting an AI summit, right? And it's around bridging and rebuilding communities. And one of the things that I brought up was that we weren't addressing inclusivity and diversity enough in the 3 days of the workshop. And they came back to me and said, okay, what does that look like? What should we include? And actually, to your point, I think what we should include is, and to Lavi's as well, is how data scientists, engineers, and anyone who's working in AI or designing AI software, how they can be educated to think about AI ethics and inclusion and diversity. And so that's my key takeaway from this. Go back and say, this is the session that we need to do.
Love it.
So yeah, I think my takeaway, and I think it's similar to some of Karthika's. We, this after this pandemic, or the last year, both Karthik and I, in our professional lives, decided to take a very different route. So we wanted to sort of focus on, things that will make a huge difference in our future, right? So we are convinced that we are in the middle of a sixth extinction, mass extinction, and if we don't fundamentally change everything, I mean, I'm not saying only the way we do business, but everything, then we may not be around to discuss the future of AI. 2050 might be a conversation about how do we stay alive, not how we use AI, right?
Exactly.
So what we thought we do in this year, from now on, is to really focus on subjects that has a transformative impact on the human condition and on the planet, right? And AI, there's obviously, there's these stories around the problems with AI, but I think you really hit the nail, hammer on the nail here, that, with a purposeful AI approach, there is actually an element that can be very transformative if we reimagine what it can do, right? And forget sort of the foibles of the past and focus on the potentials of the future. And what better time to do that than now? I mean, the pandemic has sort of, brought our mortality and our existence as a species to the fore. And so we need to sort of really rethink where we are going as a business, as a country, as a world, as a species, and what do we need to really focus on now? And I think maybe that's not percolated down to everybody, but one of the things that Karthik and I want to do is to create conversations around those topics more, not less, right? So we've sort of, even in our personal, professional lives, we only want to work with businesses, for example, that deal with what we are calling elemental technologies, things that will kill the soil, the air, the water, smart proteins that sort of, help feed the world, extinction, emergency, technologies of how we stop that from happening, equality, diversity, how do we improve the human condition, conscious capitalism, how do we make it more equitable? So those kinds of movements, organizations, and companies, that's what we want to sort of lend our expertise to. And this sort of conversations is really the takeaway, was to really sort of hopefully set up some light bulbs and get people to sort of think back and say, hey, look, maybe I need to get involved in AI. I shouldn't abscond my responsibility to say, oh, it's somebody else's problem. No, it is not somebody else's problem. So that's my takeaway.
It's
I love it.
Yeah, it's really to get everybody to think about their civic responsibility. We all and we all have to play our part. We can sit back and complain, or we can play our part.
Exactly. That's a phenomenal message.
Thank you.
And I love it.
So we'd love to have you back, and hopefully with other incredible women who are and men who are working on this field with you. And let's see what we can put together, because I think it's a subject that we should continuously sort of feature on a regular basis, because the potential for transformation is extremely high.
Absolutely.
So,
I love it.
Yeah, looking forward to having a future chat at some point. Elizabeth, stay warm and travel safe and stay healthy.
All right, you too, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you so much
It's been a
for
pleasure.
the invitation and for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Oh, thank you very much. It's been enlightening for sure. Thanks
All right.
again.
Bye.
Bye.